It started as a normal walk on a quiet street in Durango, Colorado. A police officer heading home after work and her loyal German shepherd trotting beside her. But then out of nowhere, the dog stopped and refused to move. Under an old park bench was another German shepherd, cold, hungry, and barely able to stand. What happened next would turn a simple walk into a story of loyalty, courage, and a friendship that saved a life. Before we continue, take a second to like this video, share it with someone who loves dogs, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible rescue stories. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if your dog refused to leave a stranger behind? Deep winter in Durango, Colorado had a way of making the air feel sharper than it should be. The small mountain town rested between rugged hills and the slow curve of the Animas River, where the wind carried the scent of pine and frozen water through the narrow streets. That afternoon, the sky hung low and heavy, the kind of pale white color that meant more snow was already on its way. A thick blanket of snow covered the sidewalks and the park paths, and the bare branches of cottonwood trees were outlined with frost, glittering faintly in the fading light. It was the kind of quiet evening when most people hurried home before the cold settled deeper into the valley. Emily Carter had just finished another long day at the local police department. Emily was 34 years old, a police officer with a calm but determined presence, standing about average height with an athletic build shaped by years of training. Her dark brown hair was tied neatly into a low ponytail, and her hazel eyes carried the focused alertness of someone used to observing small details others might miss. After work, she preferred simple clothes, so she wore a dark navy police jacket over a gray hoodie, dark blue jeans, and sturdy brown leather boots that could handle the icy, uneven streets of the mountain town. Walking beside her was Ranger, a nearly one-year-old male German shepherd. Ranger had a thick golden tan coat with a strong black saddle across his back, tall upright ears, and the confident stride of a dog that had once been part of a K-9 training program. His body was powerful and balanced, but his eyes carried a loyal warmth that made strangers trust him instantly. Emily had adopted Ranger after he was released from early service training, and since then the two had become nearly inseparable companions. They were following a path that curved along the small park near the Animas River. The wind cut sharply through bare branches above them, and the sound of the river, slowed by ice at its edges, flowed quietly in the distance. Ranger trotted ahead on his leash, nose close to the snow-covered ground as he explored the scents carried by the cold air. It was their usual evening routine, a slow walk to clear Emily's mind after work. Then Ranger suddenly stopped. The leash went slack in Emily's hand. At first, she thought he had caught the scent of a squirrel or a deer somewhere near the trees. She gave the leash a gentle tug. "Come on, Ranger." But the dog did not move. Instead, Ranger lowered his body slightly and stared ahead, completely still. His ears pointed forward and his attention locked onto something beneath a weathered wooden bench standing near the walking path. Emily followed his gaze. The bench looked old and forgotten, its wood gray and cracked from years of snow and harsh mountain winters. Beneath it, in the shadow between the wooden slats and the frozen ground, something shifted. Emily stepped closer and crouched slightly. At first she saw only a dark shape. Then two tired eyes blinked slowly in the dim light. A dog. It was another German shepherd, roughly the same size as Ranger, but thinner and visibly exhausted. This dog's coat was mostly dark charcoal gray with faint silver highlights around the neck and shoulders. Its fur looked tangled and dirty, and its ribs pressed faintly against the skin beneath the coat. The dog trembled slightly, not with aggression, but with exhaustion and cold. The animal tried to lift its head, but barely managed to move. Ranger slowly approached. Emily loosened the leash, watching carefully. Ranger lowered his body as he walked closer, his movements gentle and cautious. When he finally reached the shadow beneath the bench, the two dogs stopped just inches apart. Their noses touched. For a moment, neither dog moved. Then Ranger did something unexpected. He lowered himself onto the frozen ground and lay down right beside the weaker dog, pressing his body against it as if trying to share warmth. Emily let out a slow breath. "You've got to be kidding me," she murmured softly. The dark German Shepherd didn't growl or move away. It simply leaned slightly toward Ranger as if accepting the quiet comfort. Emily glanced around the park. A couple walking in the distance continued along the path without noticing anything. The river moved quietly under the gray sky. No owner called for the stray dog. No collar glinted around its neck. She stepped closer and bent down again, studying the dog carefully. The animal's eyes were tired but alert. There was no tag, no visible microchip scanner tag, only a faint mark around the neck where a rope might have rubbed the fur thin. Emily reached out slowly. The dog did not snap or pull away. It only watched her, breathing shallowly. "Easy," she said quietly. Ranger didn't move. He remained lying beside the dog like a silent guard. Emily sighed. This was not part of the plan for the evening. She had paperwork waiting at home, dinner to make, and tomorrow would be another early day at the station. But the condition of the dog made it impossible to simply walk away. She slipped one arm carefully beneath the dog's chest, preparing to lift him from the ground. That was when the sudden brightness cut through the dim evening light. Headlights. From the small parking lot at the edge of the park, a black pickup truck had just switched on its lights. The engine rumbled quietly. Emily turned her head. Inside the truck sat a man she had never seen before. He looked to be in his mid-40s with rough features partially hidden beneath a dark baseball cap. He wasn't stepping out of the vehicle. He was simply watching. But what caught Emily's attention was where his gaze was fixed. Not on her, not on Ranger. His eyes were locked on the dark German Shepherd under the bench. And the longer she looked at him, the more it felt like he had been waiting there the entire time. The headlights from the black pickup still burned across the parking lot as Emily Carter straightened slowly from beneath the park bench. The weak German Shepherd lay half in her arms now, his body heavier than it first appeared, but strangely limp from exhaustion. Up close, she could feel how thin he truly was beneath the tangled dark fur. Ranger remained pressed against her leg, watching the other dog with unwavering attention. The man in the pickup truck did not step out, did not speak, and after a moment, the engine rumbled louder. The truck rolled slowly toward the street and disappeared beyond the trees without another sound. Emily watched it go for a second longer than necessary, her instincts telling her the moment felt wrong somehow, but the trembling dog in her arms brought her attention back to the present. The animal barely reacted as she lifted him fully from beneath the bench. He was nearly Ranger's size, suggesting he was also close to a year old, but his frame felt lighter than it should have been. His charcoal gray coat was dull and tangled, and around his neck, the fur was worn thin in a ring where a rope must have rubbed for a long time. His breathing was shallow and slow. Ranger walked beside her as if guiding the way as she headed quickly toward the parking lot. Emily opened the back door of her SUV and gently laid the exhausted dog across an old blanket that Ranger usually rode on. Ranger jumped in immediately and settled beside him, pressing his warm body against the weaker dog, the same way he had under the bench. Emily climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled onto the quiet street toward downtown Durango, where the only 24-hour veterinary clinic in the area was located. The roads were nearly empty at that hour. Streetlights reflected across patches of ice and packed snow as the temperature dropped even further below freezing. The entire drive took less than 10 minutes, but Emily kept glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure the dog was still breathing. Ranger never moved away from him. When they arrived, the bright lights of the small clinic cut through the darkness. The building was modest, a single-story structure with large glass windows and a glowing red emergency sign above the door. Emily carried the dog inside while Ranger walked tightly beside her. A veterinary technician standing behind the reception desk looked up immediately. The technician was a young woman in her mid-20s with short blonde hair and rectangular glasses, wearing light blue medical scrubs and a tired but attentive expression. Her name tag read Sarah, and her voice softened when she saw the condition of the dog in Emily's arms. She quickly guided Emily into an examination room while calling for the veterinarian. Within minutes, a middle-aged man entered the room, moving with calm efficiency. The veterinarian introduced himself as Dr. Michael Harris, a tall man in his early 50s with thinning gray hair, a weathered face, and the steady demeanor of someone who had treated animals for decades. He wore a green veterinary coat over a plaid shirt and jeans. Dr. Harris gently examined the dog while Sarah prepared medical equipment. The dog barely resisted when the doctor checked his heartbeat and gums. Ranger lay on the floor beside the exam table, watching every movement closely. After several minutes, the doctor stepped back and spoke in a quiet, measured tone. The dog was severely dehydrated. His body showed clear signs of malnutrition. He was also likely carrying intestinal parasites based on the condition of his coat and weight loss. However, Dr. Harris explained that none of the problems appeared immediately fatal. With fluids, medication, and proper food, the dog had a strong chance of recovering. Sarah scanned the dog for a microchip. The handheld scanner passed slowly across his neck and shoulders. It remained silent. No chip. Emily looked down again at the faint rope mark around the animal's neck. Dr. Harris noticed it too and frowned slightly. Sarah gently placed the dog into a metal kennel inside the treatment area while preparing in 4-line. Ranger stood up and followed the movement instinctively. Before anyone could stop him, he pressed his nose through the metal bars and lay down directly against the kennel door. His ears stayed forward, his gaze fixed on the other dog. Minutes passed while the fluids began to flow through the 4-line. The exhausted dog lay quietly inside the kennel, his eyes half open but calmer now that warmth surrounded him. Sarah returned with paperwork. Her voice remained kind but practical. She explained that situations like this usually required contacting the county animal shelter or a local rescue organization. They would take responsibility for treatment and adoption placement if the animal had no identifiable owner. Emily understood the procedure. It was standard. She glanced down at the form Sarah placed on the small metal table beside her. But Ranger had not moved. He remained lying flat against the kennel door as if guarding it. The weak dog inside slowly lifted his head and rested it against the metal bars near Ranger's nose. Emily watched the two animals quietly for several seconds. The room was silent except for the steady drip of the 4-line. Dr. Harris folded his arms gently and waited. Sarah did not rush her. Emily exhaled slowly and pushed the paperwork back across the table. "No shelter," she said calmly. Sarah looked slightly surprised. Emily glanced again at Ranger, then at the recovering dog inside the kennel. "All right," she added with a small nod, her voice softer now. "You're coming home with us." The road leading out of Durango curved quietly through a stretch of tall pine trees and scattered cabins. The town lights slowly faded behind Emily Carter's SUV as she drove toward the outskirts where she lived. Night had settled fully now, and the temperature had dropped sharply, with thick frost gathering along the edges of the road and the snowbanks standing high on either side. The mountains around the valley stood dark and silent, their outlines barely visible beneath the cloudy winter sky. Inside the vehicle, the heater hummed softly, filling the cabin with warm air after the long, bitter evening. In the back seat, Ranger remained pressed closely beside the exhausted German shepherd lying on the blanket. The 4 fluids at the clinic had helped slightly, but the dark-coated dog still looked fragile and disoriented. His breathing was steadier now, though his eyes opened and closed slowly, as if he were still deciding whether the world around him could be trusted. Emily glanced at them in the rearview mirror while driving. Ranger's head rested gently across the other dog's shoulder, his body positioned like a guard. The behavior was unusual even for him. Ranger had always been loyal, but this level of quiet protectiveness felt different. It was as if he had already decided the other dog belonged with them. After about 15 minutes, the SUV turned onto a narrow gravel driveway surrounded by tall pine trees. At the end of the driveway stood Emily's home. It was a modest wooden cabin built in the typical Colorado mountain style, a single-story house with warm cedar siding and a small porch facing the forest. Soft yellow lights glowed from the windows, reflecting against the deep snow covering the ground. Inside, the house felt calm and simple. The living room held wide wooden floors polished smooth by years of use. A stone fireplace stood along one wall, already glowing with a small fire Emily had left burning earlier in the day. A worn brown leather couch faced the fireplace, and a thick woven rug lay across the floor where Ranger usually slept. Beyond the living room, a small kitchen opened toward the back of the house, and through the glass door, a fenced backyard stretched into the dark line of snow-covered pine trees. Emily parked the SUV and opened the rear door. Ranger jumped out first but did not run ahead like usual. Instead, he stood patiently while Emily carefully lifted the dark German shepherd from the blanket. The dog's weight surprised her again. He was nearly as large as Ranger, though far thinner than he should have been. Inside the house, the warmth from the fireplace spread quickly around them. Emily placed the weak dog onto the woven rug near the fire. Ranger immediately lay down beside him, pressing his body close again the same way he had done since the park. For a few minutes, neither dog moved. Emily removed her jacket and knelt beside them, studying the new arrival more carefully now that the lighting was better. The dog's coat was mostly dark charcoal with faint silver tones along the shoulders and neck. His eyes were a deep brown, tired but alert, watching every movement around him. Up close, the mark around his neck where the rope had rubbed the fur thin was easier to see. She reached out slowly and placed a bowl of water near him. The dog hesitated. His nose twitched as he smelled the water, but he didn't move toward it at first. Ranger nudged the bowl gently with his nose, pushing it slightly closer. Only then did the dark German shepherd shift forward and take a few slow drinks. Emily smiled faintly. "Good sign," she murmured. She stood and moved toward the kitchen, returning a moment later with a small bowl of soft food recommended by the veterinarian. When she placed it on the rug, the dog sniffed it but didn't begin eating. Instead, his gaze flicked briefly toward Ranger. Ranger leaned closer and began eating a small portion first. The dark dog watched carefully. Only after Ranger finished his bite did the other dog finally lower his head and begin eating slowly. Emily leaned against the couch, observing the interaction. The connection between them was unmistakable. The weaker dog seemed to measure every movement through Ranger's behavior, as if Ranger had become the guide that made the new environment feel safe. Later that evening, after the dogs had eaten and rested near the fire, Emily carried a thick blanket from the hallway closet and spread it across the rug. Ranger curled immediately on one side. The other German shepherd hesitated briefly before lowering himself beside him. The two dogs ended up pressed almost shoulder to shoulder. For the first time that night, the dark dog seemed to relax fully. Emily watched them quietly for a while before reaching for her phone. The veterinarian had asked her to monitor the dog closely for the next few days, especially for signs of dehydration or infection. She typed a quick message to the clinic, confirming they had arrived home safely. Then she looked back toward the two dogs again. "You're going to need a name," she said softly. Ranger lifted his head slightly, as if listening. Emily studied the dark-coated dog. He had followed them home like a shadow that had stepped out from beneath the park bench and into their lives without warning. "That's it," she said quietly. "Shadow." The dog didn't react to the name, but he did shift slightly closer to Ranger, resting his head along Ranger's front legs. Over the next few days, the pattern inside the house became clear. Shadow rarely moved far from Ranger. When Ranger stood, Shadow followed slowly behind. When Ranger lay down near the fireplace, Shadow curled beside him. Loud noises caused Shadow to flinch immediately. The sound of a cabinet closing too quickly or a chair scraping against the wooden floor made his body tense instantly. Each time it happened, Ranger would simply remain still beside him, calm and unmoving, until Shadow's breathing slowed again. Meals followed the same routine. Shadow refused to eat unless Ranger began eating first. If Ranger walked away from the bowl, Shadow stopped as well. Emily found herself adjusting the house without thinking about it. She moved Ranger's bed closer to the fireplace so both dogs could sleep in the warmest part of the room. She kept the lights soft in the evenings and avoided sudden noises that might startle Shadow. Through it all, Ranger remained constant, always beside him, always waiting. And slowly, almost invisibly, Shadow began to believe the house was a safe place to stay. The winter deepened around Durango as the weeks passed, with fresh snowfall arriving every few days. One evening, several weeks after Shadow had come to live with Emily Carter and Ranger, A heavy overnight snowstorm had blanketed the town, and the pine trees surrounding the small wooden house were bent low with white, and the forest beyond the backyard fence stood silent and still beneath the cold sky. Inside the house, however, warmth filled the living room. The fire in the stone fireplace crackled softly, sending waves of orange light across the wooden floor and the woven rug where the two German shepherds rested. Emily sat on the couch with a mug of coffee in her hands, reviewing a few notes from work on her tablet. Her dark navy police jacket hung over the back of a chair, and she wore a simple gray sweater and jeans now that she was home. Ranger lay stretched across the rug, his golden tan coat glowing in the firelight, while Shadow rested close beside him. Over the past weeks, Shadow had regained much of his strength. His charcoal gray coat had grown cleaner and thicker, and his ribs were no longer visible beneath the fur. But some habits had not changed. Even now, he remained close to Ranger, always within a few inches of him, as if Ranger were still the anchor that kept the world steady. Outside, the wind pushed clusters of snow against the windows. The quiet felt peaceful, almost sleepy. Emily had just leaned back on the couch when a sudden sound broke the calm. Knock! Knock! The sound came from the front door. Both dogs lifted their heads at once. Ranger stood immediately, ears forward and alert, his body tense but controlled. Shadow reacted differently. The moment the knocking echoed through the house, his body stiffened. His ears flattened and he stepped backward instinctively, retreating closer to the wall beside the fireplace. Emily noticed the difference instantly. She stood up and walked toward the door. Through the frosted glass panel beside the frame, she could see a shape outside on the porch. A tall man stood beneath the dim porch light, snow gathering across the shoulders of his dark jacket. Emily opened the door slowly. The man standing outside was the same one she had seen weeks earlier in the parking lot at the park. Up close, he looked rougher than she remembered. He appeared to be in his mid-40s with weathered skin, a thick stubble beard, and tired eyes that seemed used to staring into harsh conditions. He wore a dark baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, a worn denim jacket layered over a flannel shirt, and heavy work boots caked with snow. Behind him, parked along the roadside, stood the same black pickup truck. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man looked past Emily's shoulder toward the living room. "That dog," he said, nodding toward the house. "The dark one." Emily crossed her arms slightly. "What about him?" The man shifted his weight and exhaled slowly. "He used to be mine." The words hung in the cold winter air between them. Behind Emily, Shadow had moved farther back across the room. His body trembled slightly now, and his eyes remained locked on the figure standing in the doorway. Ranger stepped forward without growling or barking. The larger dog positioned himself directly between Shadow and the front door. His posture was calm but protective, his shoulders squared and his ears fixed forward. The man noticed. "Yeah," he muttered quietly. "That one too." Emily's gaze drifted briefly toward Shadow again. In the warm light of the living room, the faint mark around Shadow's neck was still visible where the rope had once rubbed the fur thin. She remembered the first moment she had seen it in the park. She turned back to the man. "You abandoned him," she said calmly. The man shrugged, his expression flat. "Wasn't worth the trouble," he replied. "Wouldn't listen. Kept running off." Inside the house, Shadow lowered himself slightly, his body shaking now in a way Emily had never seen before. It was not aggression. It was fear. Emily understood immediately. The man wasn't just his former owner. He had been the reason the dog had ended up beneath that park bench. Ranger remained standing between them, unmoving. The man let out a short breath and looked down at the snow collecting on the porch. Then he glanced up at Emily again. "Well," he said with a dry laugh. "Looks like he found a better place anyway." Emily didn't answer. The wind shifted, sending a swirl of snow across the porch. The man tipped his head slightly toward the house one last time. "Keep him," he said. "I don't need him anymore." He turned and walked back toward the pickup truck. The engine started moments later, and the headlights cut through the falling snow as the vehicle slowly pulled away from the house and disappeared down the narrow forest road. Emily closed the door. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed softly through the quiet living room. For several seconds, she stood still. Then she turned around. Shadow remained near the wall, his breathing slow but tense. Ranger stepped aside slightly, glancing between Emily and the other dog. Emily knelt down on the rug. "It's okay," she said gently. Shadow hesitated. Then very slowly he walked toward her. His steps were cautious at first, almost uncertain, as if he still expected the door to open again. When he finally reached Emily, he lowered his head and rested it carefully against her knee. It was the first time he had done that. Emily placed her hand softly over his head. Ranger lay down beside them again, his watchful posture relaxing now that the stranger was gone. Outside, the snow continued falling quietly over the dark forest. Inside the house, the warmth of the fire returned to the room. The deep winter in Durango slowly began to shift as the weeks continued. The most brutal snowstorms gave way to calmer mornings filled with pale sunlight reflecting brilliantly off the white-covered mountains. The pine trees surrounding Emily Carter's cabin still carried thick snow along their branches. But on the clearest days, the backyard offered enough firm ground for Ranger and Shadow to run without slipping across ice, and they made the most of every opportunity. Inside the house, the rhythm of life had changed quietly but completely. The once timid German shepherd that had arrived weak and silent from beneath the park bench was no longer the same animal. Shadow had recovered faster than Emily expected. Proper food, medication from the veterinarian, and weeks of warmth near the fireplace had filled out his once thin frame. His charcoal gray coat now shone with a healthy thickness, and his body had grown nearly as strong as Ranger's. Though Ranger remained slightly broader through the chest, the two dogs now stood almost the same height when they ran side by side across the yard. From a distance, they looked like mirror images with different colors, one golden tan with a black saddle, the other dark gray and silver with deep brown eyes that no longer held the same constant fear. Their routine had become simple but constant. In the mornings, Emily would let both dogs into the fenced backyard behind the cabin. The yard stretched wide between tall pine trees enclosed by a wooden fence. There, the two German shepherds chased each other across the snow-covered ground, their paws kicking up little sprays of white as they circled the trees and darted past the wood pile stacked near the fence. Ranger usually led the games with confident bursts of speed, but Shadow followed closely now, matching him stride for stride. In the evenings, they returned inside and collapsed near the stone fireplace in the living room. The fire cast warm orange light across the wooden floor while the two dogs slept stretched across the rug. Sometimes Ranger rested his head across Shadow's back, and sometimes Shadow leaned against Ranger's shoulder, but they were almost always touching in some small way. Meals had changed, too. At first, Emily had given them separate bowls to prevent tension, but neither dog seemed interested in guarding food from the other. Ranger would begin eating first while Shadow waited nearby. Then Shadow would step forward and eat beside him. Over time, they ended up sharing the same bowl more often than not, pushing their noses into the food together in a quiet, unspoken agreement. Emily watched these small changes carefully. She had spent enough time working in law enforcement to understand how trust developed slowly after trauma. Shadow still startled at sudden loud noises, but the difference between the frightened animal from the park and the dog living in her house now was impossible to ignore. One Saturday morning, the sky over Durango was bright and clear for the first time in days. The air still held the full bite of winter, but sunlight warmed the open spaces around town enough to make a walk feel pleasant again. Emily decided it was a good day to take both dogs back to the park near the Animas River, where she had first found Shadow. The park was transformed. A deep blanket of snow covered every surface, and the river carried chunks of ice drifting slowly downstream. Families had returned to the walking paths now that the weather had cleared. Children played near the open areas while a few joggers moved steadily along the packed trails. Emily walked along the path with Ranger on one side and Shadow on the other. Both dogs moved with the relaxed confidence of animals that finally felt secure. Near the open field beside the path, a small boy rode a bright blue bicycle along the cleared pavement. The child looked about 6 years old with short blonde hair peeking from beneath a red knit winter hat. He wore a thick green jacket, dark jeans, and small snow boots that were slightly too large for him. His mother walked several yards behind him, pushing a stroller, occasionally calling reminders for him to slow down. The boy pedaled faster than he should have. His front wheel slipped sideways on a patch of thin ice. The bicycle tilted. Within seconds, the boy tumbled onto the pavement. His hat rolled away and the bicycle clattered beside him. Emily instinctively started forward, but Shadow moved first. The dark German shepherd sprinted across the snow faster than Ranger could react, his body low and focused. By the time Emily reached the boy, Shadow was already standing beside him. The boy sat on the ground, stunned and close to tears. His small hands trembled as he looked at the scrape on his knee. Shadow lowered his head gently and nudged the boy's shoulder. Then he began licking the boy's cheek and chin with quick, soft movements. The boy blinked in surprise. For a moment, he stared at the dog's face. Then he started laughing. Ranger arrived a moment later, standing calmly beside them while Emily helped the boy sit upright. The child's mother hurried across the field toward them, her expression anxious but relieved when she saw the boy smiling again. She was a woman in her early 30s with long brown hair tucked beneath a knitted scarf and a tired but grateful look in her eyes. "Thank you," she said breathlessly as she checked her son's knee. The boy pointed at Shadow with excitement. "That dog fixed it." Emily smiled slightly. Shadow stood beside the boy quietly, tail moving slowly behind him. For a brief moment, Emily saw the memory of another scene in her mind. The trembling dog beneath the park bench, too weak to move and too frightened to trust anyone. Now that same dog stood calmly beside a child, offering comfort without hesitation. Emily placed her hand gently on Shadow's back. The dog looked up at her. In that moment, she understood something simple but powerful. The dog that once hid in fear beneath that bench had become something else entirely. Shadow had become a protector. Winter mornings in Durango, Colorado had a quiet beauty that most people only noticed if they slowed down long enough to look. The mountains that surrounded the valley reflected the early sunlight like pale silver walls, and the pine forests carried a stillness that made every small sound feel clearer. On that particular morning, the sky was bright blue after a long night of snowfall, and thin layers of frost glittered across the undisturbed snow like scattered glass. The cold air carried the sharp scent of pine and wood smoke drifting from chimneys across the valley. Emily Carter stepped out onto the small wooden porch of her cabin just after sunrise. She wore a thick gray sweater over a dark t-shirt and a pair of faded blue jeans tucked into her winter boots. Her dark brown hair was loosely tied back, and the steam from a mug of hot coffee rose slowly in the cold air as she sat down in a wooden chair facing the yard. The porch overlooked the fenced backyard and the tall pine trees beyond it, where sunlight filtered gently through snow-dusted branches. Below the porch, two German shepherds lay stretched across the snow-covered ground, where the morning sun had begun to offer its thin winter warmth. Ranger rested first, his golden tan coat with its strong black saddle catching the light. He had grown into a powerful young dog over the past year. His ears were tall and alert even when he was resting, and his posture carried the quiet confidence of a dog trained to pay attention to everything around him. Beside him lay Shadow. At first glance, someone might think the two dogs were brothers. Shadow had grown stronger and healthier with every passing week since the day Emily brought him home. His charcoal gray coat now carried deep silver tones along the shoulders and neck, thick and clean, where once it had been dull and tangled. His body had filled out with proper muscle and weight, and standing beside Ranger, he now looked almost identical in size. From above, where Emily sat on the porch, the two dogs curved slightly toward each other as they rested in the sunlight. Their bodies touched lightly at the shoulders, almost like two commas lying side by side on the white page of snow. The difference between them was no longer fear. It was simply color. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or bright lights in the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly in the form of a small moment that almost goes unnoticed. A walk that suddenly stops. A dog that refuses to move. A life waiting under a bench for someone who is willing to stay. Maybe that is how God works in the world, placing small choices in front of us and waiting to see if we will listen to the quiet voice that says don't walk away. In our daily lives, we are often busy, distracted, rushing from one responsibility to another. It becomes easy to pass by someone or something that needs help. But stories like this remind us that compassion can change everything. One moment of kindness, one decision to stay instead of leaving, can become the beginning of a completely different future for another life. Perhaps that day Ranger was not just being stubborn. Perhaps God used a loyal dog to guide someone toward the right choice. And because of that moment, a frightened dog found a home. A family became bigger, and a life that once trembled in the cold now sleeps in warmth. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who believes in kindness and second chances. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or share your own story about a dog that changed your life. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you real moments of hope, loyalty, and unexpected miracles. May God bless you, your family, and every step you take today. And may we all remember that sometimes the smallest act of love can become the miracle someone else has been waiting for. For several minutes, Emily watched them quietly while sipping her coffee. The cold morning air made the steam from her mug curl slowly upward. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of a truck moving along the highway outside town, and the quiet chatter of a few birds waking in the snow-covered trees. The house behind her felt peaceful, too. The fire in the living room had burned down to soft embers overnight, and the warm scent of cedar would still drifted faintly through the doorway behind her. Ranger shifted first. He lifted his head slightly, blinking in the sunlight. Shadow's ears twitched at the movement, and a moment later, he opened his eyes as well. The two dogs looked at each other briefly. Then both of their tails began moving slowly across the snow. Emily smiled. It was such a small thing, but she had learned to notice those small things since Shadow entered their lives. The first time she had seen him beneath that park bench, the dog had barely been able to lift his head. Fear had lived in every movement of his body. Even the sound of footsteps had made him shrink back. Now he stretched comfortably in the morning sunlight beside another dog he trusted completely. Emily leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. "You know," she said quietly, her voice carrying softly across the yard. Neither dog understood the words, but both ears turned toward her. Ranger stood up slowly and shook the snow from his coat before walking toward the porch. Shadow rose beside him a moment later, following closely but without the hesitation he once had. Emily continued speaking as they approached. Ranger didn't stop that day because he was stubborn. The two German shepherds climbed the short steps onto the porch and sat beside her. Ranger positioned himself near her left leg while Shadow settled near her right side, their bodies forming a calm circle around the chair. Emily reached down and placed one hand on each dog's head. Both dogs leaned gently into the touch. Their tails moved again, brushing lightly against the wooden boards of the porch. The sunlight had climbed higher now, warming the cabin walls and sending fine lines of melt running down the snow-covered fence. Beyond the yard, the forest shimmered, every branch outlined in white and silver. Shadow closed his eyes for a moment, resting his head briefly against Emily's knee. There was no fear left in the gesture, only trust. Emily looked down at him and shook her head softly with a quiet laugh. "Funny how things work out," she murmured. Ranger leaned against her other leg at the same time, and for a moment she found herself surrounded by two nearly identical shapes of warm fur and steady breathing. Not long ago, one of those dogs had been a stranger hiding beneath a park bench. Now he was part of something much bigger, part of the quiet rhythm of a home. The morning continued peacefully as the three of them sat together on the porch. Snow sparkled across the yard while the winter sunlight brightened the trees. Eventually, Ranger stepped down into the yard again, trotting toward the fence where he liked to patrol the edges of the property. Shadow followed beside him, matching his pace easily. They moved across the yard together, one golden tan, one charcoal gray, their tails lifting slightly as they walked through the fresh snow. Emily watched them for a moment longer, and she realized something simple. Shadow was no longer the abandoned dog from beneath the park bench. He was home,